Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nadje Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at Brown University. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our first online event this semester, Decorations from the Fleeting Moment, in conversation with Annabel Daou. Today's event is part of a wider series called Gender and Body Politics, Arts in the Middle East and its Diasporas. And the series is co-convened by the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown University and Columbia University's Middle East Institute. Over the past month, well, actually years now, my co-convener, Professor Kathryn Spellman Poots, and I have been in discussion with a number of artists, including Palestinian artist Basil Abbas and Ruan Abu Rahmeh, the Lebanese artist Tanya Al-Khouri, and Iranian artist Murashin Al-Yahari and Ametis Mutavelli. And against the backdrop of war, conflict, the rise of authoritarian regimes, displacement and diaspora mobilization, as well as Islamophobia and ongoing Orientalist depictions, the series explores the ways in which artists are informed by and or contribute to anti-Islamophobic, anti-racist, transnational feminist and queer praxis. And as part of this ongoing conversation and engagement with art and body politics in relation to the Middle East, we will be in conversation with Annabel Daou. My colleague, Professor Kathryn Spellman Poots, will introduce Annabel in a moment, but I just wanted to also let you know that we're planning to have time for Q&A. So if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat function of the webinar. Let me introduce Kathryn to you. So Kathryn Spellman Poots is an associate professor at Columbia's Middle East Institute and the Aga Khan University in London, where we met many years ago. Hello, Kathryn. Kathryn's research focuses on women and gender dynamics in Muslim communities in the UK and the US. She has a particular interest in rituals and cultural production within the context of diasporic spaces and their connections to wider social movements. Kathryn, over to you.
Great. Hello, Nadje. Hello, everyone. I am really happy to introduce Annabel Daou to the Gender and Body Politics series. I think she's going to come up on the camera soon. Hello. Hi, Annabel. Hello. Hi. It's just been an absolute joy getting to know Annabel and her work over the past couple of years, and we're really happy for you to be part of our series. So welcome. I'm delighted to introduce you. Annabel's work is really multifaceted. It takes form in paper-based constructions, sound, performance, and video. Annabel suspends, she carves out and records the language of day-to-day life, from the ordinary or mundane to the intimately personal and the urgently political. Annabel was born and raised in Beirut and lives now here in New York. Her work has been exhibited internationally, nationally, including recently at the National Museum of Beirut, the Kunstraum in Munich, and the Artforum in Istanbul. She's had several recent solo exhibitions as well, including Declaration at the Ulrich Museum of Art, and she had another solo show called Global Spotlight, Annabel Daou, at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Arlington. And she had a beautiful exhibition called Only If, that Nadje and I both got to see together and experience together. And was at Signs and Symbols on the Lower East Side in New York. Her work has been widely reviewed in platforms such as Artforum, Flash Art, ARTnews, and Canvas magazine. And her public collections include the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Koç Foundation in Istanbul, the Ulrich Museum of Art, the Warehouse in Dallas, the Morgan Library, the Yale University Art Gallery, and many other places. And Annabel is currently teaching a drawing course at Barnard, right here on campus, which is wonderful, which is also her alma mater. So a very warm welcome to you. We're really excited for today's events. And Nadje, would you like to start with some questions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, welcome, Annabelle. It's great to be in conversation. We've been over the last couple of years. Kathryn, you and I have been talking about your work and how we would like to engage with it. And so when I think about artists from the Middle East, especially female artists, and the kind of reception in the US and Europe, but also in the Middle East, I think about different generations. And I'm wondering how you would categorize and differentiate different generations of female artists, and how would you position yourself within that categorization?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you both. I'm so happy to be here. I think I would position myself as somebody who's really tried hard to not be categorized, either by gender, nationality, or anything else in general. I think when I was growing up in Lebanon, so I grew up during the Civil War there, I think my generation were people really desperately looking for a normal life, which the war stole from us, So I think for me, there wasn't really an example of, at least in my visible sphere, of women art, even of artists in general, but certainly not of women artists, even though there were definitely generations making art, but they were not in my view. I think the first person who really affected me was Mona Hatoum, because I think seeing somebody deal with conceptual art, with political issues, it gave me some sense of familiarity, But I think when I came here, really what I wanted to do was be a free artist, not to somehow escape the gendered part of living in Lebanon, which, being a woman in Lebanon at the time, didn't feel like I had very much freedom. But then again, what I would always say is, like, living in a war, that kind of overrides a lot of, just trying to get away from it, to try to find possibility. I think that was, the key element of my pursuit when I left Lebanon.
Yeah, thank you. That resonates a lot with some of the Iraqi artists I talked to, who also, that I think was a sort of big motivation, or something that informed both their leaving, but also then the artwork.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you trying to escape the categories that can be placed on you. But that said, I have a question that I'm wondering how you negotiate being part of an art world where Middle Eastern women often experience either hypervisibility or marginalization. And depending on the kind of work they do, and also the appeal their work has to a Western context.
Yeah. Well, I really tried to build my career, I would say, between the cracks, really, which, and in some cases you end up falling between the cracks. But, to me, those cracks are where freedom lie. So basically, I have this feeling that society tries, at least this system, tries very hard to identify you. It wants your identity, and it wants it in a very simplistic way. So for me, over the years, I've given this talk called Against Identity. And what I was trying to do was really pressure the different aspects of my identity and question how I could negotiate them in their myriad facets, which I think the difference with the system is that the system tries very hard to pressure our identity to push it into an easy label, which to me is the opposite of freedom. So I would say that, the hypervisibility now of certain female artists, particularly older ones who really have to struggle to continue to make their work literally in the cracks, is another flip side of the same thing, because it's a kind of idea that we can, package people if we understand them. And to me, that's exactly what I was trying to run away from, or what I keep trying to run away from. Does that?
Yeah.
Kind of, I feel like there is an issue also, because while I identify very much as somebody from that part of the world, there are very big differences between all of our experiences, and many of us are half and half, different cultures, many of us have lived in different places. So I think that's when I say pressuring against it, trying to find out what it is that is actually that you're really negotiating. That's a big element of
that in-betweenness, which is I think what you're getting at, and I think that really comes out in your work as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nadje.
Yeah, so having, as Kathryn already said, been able to visit and experience one of your exhibitions, but also seeing, looking at your artwork more broadly, one method that stands out to me is this idea of call and response, which I think is a key method that you use in your work. And I was wondering if you can explain to us a little bit, can you clarify what is actually meant? How do you use this method? And also linked to that, I mean, I know you say, you don't want to be categorized, but I mean, to my mind, gender does play a role, right? Yeah. And so what role does gender play in the artistic process? And I don't know if you're able to share some artwork at this point to sort of illustrate this. It would be great.
Yeah, I'll frame one of the pieces and then I'll show it. One of the practice that I take is asking people questions, but I ask a broad spectrum of people. So it's not limited to my community or to the art world. I send out calls, and it's usually a very simple question. So what I could show right now is a project that I did in 2022, where I asked people, what do you forgive yourself for? And I'm going to frame, when in response to the gender question, for me, gender always appears in the rearview mirror after the fact. When I look at the work and I think about where it may be intruding on notions of what we think of as a woman's role. I mean, I was thinking this morning, actually, I'm very interested in repetition, obviously, repetition of the same question, often repetition of the same phrases. And I think historically, women's work has been repetitive work. It's work that is kind of, something that structures our lives, actually. The aspects of our daily lives, of our home lives, have generally been women just repeatedly, even as simply as washing dishes. Now, even though things have changed, it's still, to a large extent, repetitive women's work. So I think there's that aspect. And then with what do you forgive yourself for? I was thinking, I asked people, and I got responses from men and women, from people of all genders, and then I voiced it myself, which is very often what I do. I get responses from people and then I voice the piece. So I'm actually putting their words into my mouth, and there's a kind of unity between everybody, and also a kind of erasing of gender and of voice, while at the same time conjoining all of these voices. So I'll share my screen right now.
I forgive myself for abandoning the child within me.
I forgive myself for abandoning the child within me for so many years.
For being a bitch in high school.
I forgive myself for being a bitch in high school.
I forgive myself for forgetting how grateful
I forgive myself for forgetting how grateful I should be for everything.
for nothing.
I forgive myself for nothing. I forgive myself for nothing.
I forgive myself for very little.
I forgive myself for very little.
I forgive myself for hurting my own mom. I forgive myself for hurting my own mom. I don't forgive myself for anything because I'm too young. I don't forgive myself for anything because I'm too young. I forgive myself for being a man. I forgive myself for being a man. I forgive myself a man who hasn't been socialized as a man and doesn't have the body of a man. Socialized as a man. I forgive myself for not being as others. I forgive myself for not being as others want me to be.
This piece is actually played on 3 separate speakers, and they're each mono. In this case, I have to make it stereo, so generally you would hear it with the voice repeating but coming out from different speakers. Another work that is kind of call and response is it's called When in the Course of Human Events. I ask people to complete the sentence, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary to. And they sent me the rest of that sentence. As you can see here, some of the responses. What I did was I created this long scroll-like piece, which I'll show the full image in a second, and then I actually made a sound piece where I read these sentences in the first person. So what I'll show next is a video, which is not an actual video, it's just a video of the piece with the sound piece playing.
I take a deep breath. I hold out my hands. I hold back my tears. I scream in the night.
I wait for the dawn.
I wait for the dawn.
I take to the streets.
I take to the streets.
I run for the hills.
I run for the hills.
I loosen my grip. I
loosen my grip. I lighten my load. I shoulder the burden. I break up the fight. I howl at the moon. I leave nothing behind. I save what I can. I mess it all up.
I tear it all down. I take what I want. I take what is mine. I give what I have. I lay down my arms. I take off my mask. I stare at the sun. I aim for the stars. I wear my heart on my sleeve.
I wonder how it got to this. I finish what someone else has started.
I finish what someone else has already started.
I wait for the tide to come in. I wait for the fear to subside. I discard the Constitution because it is an anti-democratic relic.
So I'll stop sharing my screen now. In both these pieces, there are the voices of the many. I mean, you can see there are hundreds of responses, and what I'm really interested in the call and response is the idea of, you know, declarations from the fleeting present, the idea of somehow capturing a moment through the voices of many different people. Most of the time the people don't know each other, and there's this kind of sense of how we're unified in this space. This piece, When in the Course of Human Events, was made in 2019, and it was really kind of about the street, in a sense, about listening to the streets of the world. Yeah, I mean, I feel like some aspects of call and response that have kind of influenced me, even though it's not particularly that, is zajan in Arabic, which is a call and response between 2 poets, generally a masculine male, which has been changing recently. But yeah, the idea that and it deals with it's in colloquial Arabic, and it deals with populist themes. So
yeah. Kathryn, do you mind? I just have a sort of quick follow-up question, Annabel. So in terms of getting people to contribute, I mean, your art seems to be very interactive. I mean, how do you go about actually identifying people? And then once they have contributed, do you make any effort for them to see what you did with, you know, their voices?
yeah, that's
The relationship, the afterlife of, you know, kind of getting someone to.
Well, there are the 2 parts. I mean, you know, I very often consider that a part of my practice is this interaction with the person, recording them or speaking to them or reading what they write and interacting after that. But yeah, I do try, the way that I reach out generally, if it's in an art situation, very often the institution or the gallery will send out emails. But I also just tell friends. I email to people that I know. I have them pass it on. You know, I try to make it, I give it enough time that there's an expansive act of collecting. And I never edit what people say, and I never sequence it. I just take it as it comes. So there's a kind of lack of manipulation there, but also I try to tell people every time I'm in contact with them, I can send you the video, or you can see it in such and such a place. And it's, but there is a limitation to that. There's definitely a limitation, and there's also a dynamic there, which is, I talk about wanting the voices of the many. That's true. And I think that there is a desire for that expanse, but there also always does end up the selfishness of the artist, where in the end, this is a work that I've made. I try very hard to make the interaction between people be something that for them, anyway, no one ever gives me anything that they don't want to give. And I think very often people want to feel that their voice is included somewhere, even if they never know where that is.
Yeah. Thank you.
I actually took part in the first one that you talked about. What do I forgive myself for?
Yeah.
And I remember thinking and contemplating on that question for a long time, and it was really moving when you sent me the entire piece, and to hear so many other voices answering that same question. And as a collective, it was so powerful. It's a really interesting method, this call and response. And you mentioned listening to the streets, which leads to my next question. You've taken part in a lot of protests and demonstrations in the Middle East, in New York, and around the world. And you focus particularly on the sounds and rhythms of the streets. So I'm wondering if you could share the ways in which you experience and the impressions that you have gained from this listening to the streets, and how that feeds back into your work and shapes your work.
Yeah, I mean, I love city streets. I love New York. I love Beirut, and I think I've always felt this kind of sense that what we leave behind in our lives is another layer of sound to the city, another layer to the sidewalks of of the sounds of our lives. With respect to protests, in 2019, this is why I want to show and talk a little bit about declaration and when in the course of human events. The reason I made that piece is because there were so many protests across the world. Everybody seemed to be in the streets, from Chile to Lebanon to New York. It was just, and so what I decided to do, and I don't know if you can really hear it in the piece, because the sound piece is actually 24 minutes. And it contains within it, underneath my voice reading all of this, the sounds of protests across the world. And it wasn't always me. I wasn't, I wasn't in all these places, but a lot of my friends were sending them to me in real time, or recording them and letting me hear them. My collaborator who was in Lebanon, Rania Shabat, she was just recording these as she was walking through as they were all marching in Thawra. And, I felt like at that point, I truly felt, I think we all felt that it couldn't go back. Everybody was in the streets and couldn't go back. I showed this work in January of 2020 at Signs and Symbols. We literally closed the show as everything started to happen. And it's kind of moving, because it felt inconceivable to me at the time when I was making the piece that we would ever not be in the streets. And literally 2 months later, there was no one in the streets. So, there was a kind of part of that. I just will also say that for me, a large part of my work is trying to, in some way, express the concept of being here and being here together. So I think the street is actually very much, the topic that how we negotiate being together in the street is a really interesting one to me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was part of a project where with a group of anthropologists who were experiencing protest movements during that time period, not only in the Middle East, but around the world. And even though each anthropologist talked about the historical particularities of the different movements and how they link to local politics and different forms of oppression or corruption that were very specific to the space, the point of the book was showing how they were all connected, and how through aesthetics, through arts, through poetry, there was really a global movement that was also happening, and it sort of reverberated, and it was sort of a contagion itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just really interesting. Yeah, thank you. Did you want to show work now or after the next question? Follow up?
I believe we were, I thought I would show worry in the next.
Yeah. I'm going to ask a question in that direction, but actually I just also wanted to say in terms of sort of street protest, and I mean, I totally understand, and I had the same feelings that there's no way that well, people, and I was particularly concerned with, feminist activists, but also, friends and colleagues in places like Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt. I also thought there's no way that people will stop protesting, and something has shifted, and we know that it's not just in Lebanon where the protest stopped. But interestingly, I think that what though has remained is precisely the kind of the resistance and the protest that is now articulated in the cultural realm through literature, film, art, and that however repressive regimes have been, they have not been able to actually stop that. So I think that is something that really sort of the shift from politics that wasn't even sort of party political, but it was, sort of social movement. But now, all the sort of politics and all the feelings of dissent seem to be channeled into the cultural sphere. But I wanted to ask you about one of the themes that I also thought was running through your work. It's the theme of the way that people experience traumatic collective experience, and you often do that from the perspective of individual isolation. So I find that sort of collective trauma and individual isolation is something that I see throughout your work. And on the one hand, I find that the work brings out so-called flattening, one can speak about flattening effects of trauma and forms of oppression. But at the same time, your work is sensitive to different positions of power that make a big difference to the way one experiences shared events. So there's flattening, but there's also, different people experiencing it very differently. So now with this in mind, I was wondering if you could discuss your work, for example, the film A Year Like One Another, and your work I Will Worry for You From Dusk to Dawn.
And I could show an image, and then I'll share my screen just to talk about worry. Also, just to talk about first the idea of traumatic experiences, and I lived through a war, I've lived through 9/11, lived through COVID. You think about the vastness of these experiences, but then they're actually made up of the tiny little aspects of each of our daily lives, because when you zero down into how we're experiencing them, we're just living. So I'm very interested in that concept. If you look at it as a whole, it's a big traumatic experience, but then when you kind of microscope into it, it's this tiny little network of all of our lives, slightly affected or largely affected. I'll share a screen and talk about worry. So at the end, at the very beginning of 2020, I was doing this project in the lobby of my building in Brooklyn. And I was inviting artists to show work in the lobby. And then I decided that I was going to make a set of worry beads, which is this set of 12 worry beads. And I was going to invite people to walk back and forth across the lobby for an hour, and then pass a worry on to somebody else, or a concern, a burden. And then the other person would walk back and forth and continuously do that. Of course, lockdown started, everything started to go to hell. And so I decided that in the end, in March of 2020, I decided I would do it myself. And I ended up having to do it in my own hallway because I couldn't, walk in the lobby. So I invited people to send me a worry that they had and to choose a time on a timesheet. So they would know that I was walking for them at that time. And I walked from 6 p.m. till 6 a.m. without stopping. I would stop every 15 minutes, pick up a paper, look at their worry, put it in my mind in some kind of way, and walk back and forth. So this is, and we live streamed it on Instagram so that people could join in anytime in the middle of the night. They could join in and see me walking for them. Or just join in and feel connected to somebody. It's complicated taking on worries. First of all, I'm not sure worry is such a great thing to highlight, really, or even to negotiate, because in the end, worry is like someone once told me, it's a negative form of prayer. But I do think that what I was trying to indicate was how we can share each other's burden and maybe lighten it a bit. It's funny that I decided to do this before COVID, and that it kind of coincided with it. The other thing is I was thinking a lot about my father walking back and forth, the men walking back and forth in the hallway smoking cigarettes throughout my childhood as we were, locked up during the war in our apartments. So that was one aspect of it. I felt like I was taking on this role, and there is a to me, there was a gendered aspect of these men walking back and forth, smoking or counting their worry beads. The next project, which is, I'm sorry, the next project is so sorry,
بفتكر اجى جيل تاني.
Sorry. Forgive me.
It's okay.
Yeah. A year like any other, thinking about, as people started saying, this is a year like no other, I began to think about, well, there have been so many years like this for different people. It's every day in some place, something happens that is extremely traumatic or extremely life-changing. And so I decided to clock the entire year. I chose an event. I looked up events that were happening across the world every single day. And I chose one for every day. They were very disparate, and some of them were actually personal things that were happening in my life or in people around me. And I made this video, which also contains within it me basically in my room trying to negotiate being alone in this space. There was also a running theme through it where I'm trying to teach myself the Vehbi, which is a communal dance, usually, generally danced by men. Also not the case anymore, but so I'm learning to dance the dance by myself. That's a communal dance. I'll show the video now, and you can speak a little further about it.
January 1, a million protesters take to the streets. January 2, a man who was making art dies. January 3, a drone strike kills a general. January 4, an invitation to an exhibition is received. January 5, a man recalls a photograph he took of a young woman once. January 6, a prolific serial rapist is sentenced to life in prison. January 7, a stampede takes place at a general's funeral. January 8, a plane is shot down shortly after takeoff. January 9, a rare circumbinary planet is discovered. January 10, a group of friends attend an art opening. January 11, a 100-year-old tortoise retires to the wild. January 12, a volcano erupts and thousands are evacuated. January 13, a man dies in prison after a hunger strike. January 14, a contribution of $2.70 is made to a political campaign. January 15, a mutiny is quelled by armed forces. January 16, a trial to impeach a politician begins. January 17, an artist meets a friend for coffee at a former dance club. January 18, a drone strike kills 80 military personnel. January 19, a blizzard causes several deaths from hypothermia. January 20, a country honors a man who was assassinated. January 21, a country announces its first case of a virus. January 22, a report says that a massive fire has killed 1 billion animals. January 23, a city is sealed off to prevent the spread of a virus. January 24, a citywide protest calls for the withdrawal of an occupying army's troops. January 25, a photograph is taken of a rainbow arching over a building. January 26, an athlete dies in a helicopter crash. January 27, an infected man is placed in an isolation ward. January 28, a peace plan is signed by 2 corrupt politicians. January 29, an officer is charged with murder for shooting a man whose hands were cuffed. January 30, a public health emergency of international concern is declared. January 31, a kingdom and an island formally withdraw from a union.
So the other part of this project was a sequence of 12 works, one on microfiber paper, where I was cutting into the paper in a very physical way. I was, locked in my studio, and I was putting language from each month into the work. It almost like our calendar pages. This is an image at Gallery Tanya Wagner where I showed the work in 2021. You can't see all the pieces, but each one of them really was me almost negotiating how to hold on to what was actually what I was documenting, and how that actually affected my body. It's one of the first works where I really included my body. Later in the video, I'm trying to get my head out of a shirt, something that's always stressed me out, trying to get my head out of a tight shirt. But I think I was really also thinking, talking about the flattening effects and about other people's experiences. What is actually left of a year? What's left in our lives? What's left in the rubble of history, basically? What do we, whose story gets told? How does class, how does power, how does your position in society reflect what's left of history and how we read history? So yeah, these are the first works where I was working with this idea of kind of suspending language, almost trying to catch it in flight. And this, the show, Only If, that we were speaking about, Signs and Symbols, had a series of works that had the word only in them, and this is only one story. And what I was trying to get at is exactly the difference between these individual, we each have a story, we're each trying to hold on to our only one story, but then in the repetition, it both flattens out and creates a terrain that can be read from many different positions and in many different ways. So it's this kind of push and pull. It's kind of, yes, the in-betweenness, and also the extreme attempt to hold on to the present. And then I'll show just one more work in this series, which is Only My War, Only Your War, which, again, also thinks about the idea of like, whose battle are we talking about? So I'll stop sharing my screen now. Yeah. It's difficult to say, I think that I was really interested in this project to kind of erase as much as I could the notion of hierarchy. And that's a running theme in my work. I really think what do we think is important, and what do we think is important to ourselves, and what do we think is important to the broader community and humanity in general. So it's for me, it's really a kind of push and pull between those two things always. And I really want people, when they look at my work, to kind of feel themselves there. And very often the writing actually does something there, because you're looking at this work that has a kind of uniformity to it. All of these works are hand cut by me. So there's also the time that it took me to do that that's embedded in this space. And I feel like the time of people reading it and standing in front of it and finding that kind of repetition within themselves, which at some point sometimes brings them to a specific moment. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's I find it is a challenging tension, though, you know, to on the one hand, I mean, you clearly do engage with lots of the sort of big questions of our time, and also, you know, with the experience in the background of war and conflict in Lebanon and ongoing issues there. But then, you know, the way that the individual might not be always thinking about, you know, the big issues, or how, you know, the big issues actually translate in very surprising and curious ways in terms of our everyday experiences. But to kind of deal with them both, I find that very challenging.
I do too, actually. But I would, it's for me, it's really in between. I talk about the cracks, but for me, it's in between the breaks. It's those little spaces in between that, between this massive thing and this very, very small thing, that I really am always trying to aim to capture in my work in some way, or at least is a driving force for me.
I also think that your paper constructions really showed the fragility of what we're talking about, and how it's really hard to capture it, and it's so fragile, because it's really thin paper in terms of the material that you're using, that you're cutting from. It's very light, isn't that right?
Yeah, but I've always been interested in the idea of how do you make something bigger than the smallness that it is. And by that, I mean, for example, like, you know, a lot of my work has this element of fragility and is almost not there very often. But then again, it actually is very often dealing with larger themes or repetition, and so I'm always trying to negotiate that bigness and smallness in a way, and fragility and power, because, and when I talk about lots of voices, and I think the power in that, I think it expresses both power and fragility when we think about the many, because it's there's a force there, but that force is very tenuous, because of the fragility of our links with each other, and because of the fragility of each of us.
Yeah. Just should I move on, Nadje?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, well, just to think about the connections that you make, and the connections between people, reminded me of the importance of rituals and gestures that run continuously through your work. So I'm wondering how you conceive of rituals and gestures, and how do you use them in your work to connect with your audiences?
I would say none of them are ceremonial or religious. I think you know more about ritual than I do, but I think way more. But I think that it's, for me, it's really how I structure what I'm doing, and how people come into that. So, for example, with forgiveness, asking people this question and having them think about, you know, the response always brings a kind of quiet to the exchange. There's another project that I've done. We probably don't have time, but I just would quickly speak about it. I write people's fortunes silently, and they sit in front of me with their hands open, and I write their fortune and hand them the paper back with their fortune on it. And what's interesting in that exchange is, like, I do this for a couple of hours, and it becomes this very quiet routine, and everybody starts to notice it, people standing in line. So when they come and sit in front of me, they take on a kind of solemn, poetic way of dealing with it. And I find that really interesting, how these repeated gestures, these small exchanges between people, create a certain kind of poetry, which I'm interested, the kind of poetry of the everyday, in a way. And they're not, again, these are not big, expansive things. They're really kind of very, very tiny exchanges.
Interesting. I also wanted to ask, you know, commentators have noted that your work is a reminder of the feminist maxim that the personal is political. which I read somewhere in one of the publications about your work. So I'm just wondering if you could then highlight the social and political importance of this ordinary language and the gestures and, in your work, like the fortunes that you just spoke about.
I think, I think we think of politics in a way that is, in many ways, we think we're kind of, that we have an effect on the political system, but I think to a large extent, the political system negates us all the time. It negates our everyday life. It oppresses, it kind of eradicates the singularity of our experiences. And so for me, the idea of kind of enmeshing these little stories with the bigger picture is a way of trying to grasp how the political plays a role in our lives and how we can have a notion that our lives together have a certain power as well. We see everything that's happening with unions at the moment and all of that. The idea that somehow if we are together in our small experiences of our day-to-day lives, we also have political power. So for me, it really is another form of, the enmeshment of these two ideas, really, the singular and the many.
Interesting. Right.
So I mean, there is still a little bit of time for questions from the audience. So if you have any question or comment, please put it in the chat. Meanwhile, I know that you've already said in the beginning that you try to evade categorization, but it's one thing to try to avoid categorization, but it's another thing to be received differently in different contexts. And I'm sort of wondering what is happening there. And I mean, obviously, there is sort of different audiences within the US, and there is, I know you had exhibitions in Europe and Germany, and then of course there's the Middle East, and I don't know if you've also been to other parts of the world, but so what for you is most striking in terms of the reception in different contexts, if at all? I mean, maybe it's an issue.
Yeah, I mean, like I was trying to say, I've really tried to sidestep being categorized as anything. And I say that because even though I consider myself Lebanese and very attached to Lebanon, I never really showed there. And part of it, I have many different reasons for it. I think it was very difficult for me to see it as a place where one would make or exhibit art, because I left when I was 18, even though my parents stayed there, and I went back off and I never really lived there again. So for me, but people know where you come from, and if you make political work and you come from there, they see you as, a Lebanese artist. I don't, at this point, I really don't care very much anymore. What does concern me is to put myself in a place where I can't be read on multiple levels. So I say that to say that I think I was fearful of showing in Lebanon for those reasons. And I eventually did do a project at the National Museum where I invited people from the street to come into the museum and give voice to the objects of the collection from their position today. And we created an audio guide, an audio work really, that is available. I think it's probably even still available at the museum, where you could walk through the museum and listen to the people from Beirut. Like literally we walk down the steps of the museum and ask people in. So it's from all walks of life, people who thought that the place was a bank. Which, for all intents and purposes, it isn't really like a place that is for the people. So it does have a kind of, and I say that because when I wanted to do the project in Arabic, I was told over and over again, well, you have to do it in French or in English or both so that visitors can listen to it. And I was adamant that if we were making it for the people and by the people, that it really needed to be in Arabic, which was tough for me because I hadn't, been speaking Arabic that often when I went and did it. So yeah, I don't know if that quite answers your question. I don't really know how. I'm very interested in context, but all I can do is negotiate the context. I can't be sure how people take it in that context. You know?
Yeah, no, I get that. I am going to push you a bit though on the issue of Lebanon, because I mean, not in any way to challenge you on, I mean, your personal experience, but I'm a bit surprised by what you say in terms of Lebanon is not a good place to show art, because I have to say that although it's very outside of my area of expertise, but one of the really sort of interesting and moving experiences in terms of giving talks was, I don't know how many years back, maybe 10 years ago, I was invited to this art show or art initiative in Beirut, Ashkal Alwan.
Yeah.
And so I was there for a week, and I was part of a panel about, you know, conflict and war. And so I was speaking about Iraq, but I was very impressed to see the dynamism. And, you know, I was giving this talk with a Turkish person who had written against militarism, and the room was full of young people, including men, who clearly were thinking through ideas around gender and masculinity, and were trying to express that in art. And so, yeah, I guess I wonder, so what is it? What's the discomfort in terms of Lebanon?
Well, Lebanon has an extremely vibrant art scene, and I truthfully am very close and really excited by what's happening there. I'm speaking entirely personally. Over the years, you know, more recently, I feel probably more connected to it, having done this project. But I think for me, it was an extremely personal thing. It was the idea that maybe that somehow Lebanon was, I didn't feel like I could go back there and make work about trauma. And I think maybe because I had too much trauma there, or maybe because I felt it a kind of instrumentalizing of something that was just, first of all, still very difficult for so many people. That is not to judge or say anything about the Lebanese art world is extremely vibrant. I was just recently there. I could not believe how many people came to this talk.
Yeah.
It was 200 people, and honestly, like, you couldn't get those people in New York, and you couldn't get that energy. It's really amazing. And so I would say, you know, it's my own personal thing. I was hesitant. I was scared that in some way I would be choosing some position that I couldn't let go of, which is when I talk about categorization and all of that. I think when I left Lebanon, I was looking for freedom not to be defined as a woman, freedom not to be defined as, and of course, none of those things ever work because you always end up defined. But I personally have tried to be careful to keep hopping from one thing to the other so that I don't have to deal with that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that really answers.
Yeah, sure. No, that clarifies it. Yeah, thanks.
Yes. So.
Kathryn, do you want to read out the question from the audience, or?
I think the questions were about the art scene in Lebanon. So I feel that you and they even noted that I think that the question was answered.
Yeah.
So, it was more of a clarification on Annabelle's part, just to explain her position on that.
It's not, it's no judgment at all, because I feel very strongly that there's a strong community that, and it's admirable what they managed to do given the circumstances that they're constantly dealing with.
So we just have a couple minutes left. Did you want to show one other thing?
I could show a minute of Shuhaida, which is the project that I was just talking about.
That would be great.
Okay.
بفتكر اجا جيل تاني، جيل جديد هو اللي اخذني وحطني بس تحت فرشة للعالم الجديدة انه شو بتعمل الحرب بالانسان.
انا ما انكسرت، في حدا كسرني.
اكيد بحس حالي اني مظلوم.
حل ما انا موجودة هيدا البلد مش حاسة حالي
وحطوني هون بالمتحف.
يعني هيك متوازنة ومستقرة.
كنت مخبى واجت أزيفة
آمن، مش حاسة بأمان
على البيت عنا. أمي وبيي ماتوا بس أنا تشوهت، عشت مشوه.
أنا يلي بغير الطريقة يلي أنتم بتشوفوني فيها وقت اللي أنا أطلع عليكم.
خلقت
خلقان بالعيون.
أمي لبنانية بس بيي مش لبناني. أمي ما فيها تعطيني جنسية.
هلا بفتكر انا ما في احكي بقى لانه انا صرت هون بس تمثال، بس بقدر ساعد الناس من ورا شكل اللي صار من بعد الحرب.
فيني ساعد بالحكي على الاشياء اللي شفتها من قبل. كنت انا موجود من قبل، اكيد فيني خبر شو وصلت الحرب اخر شيء وشو عملت الحرب اخر شيء.
So, yeah, I'll stop screen sharing. Yeah, this is just a small. I eventually ended up making a video of the audio guides so as to be able to have a way to actually present it outside of Lebanon. And this is one segment of it. And you can what's beautiful, it's hard to understand, what's beautiful in this whole piece is the different voices of people, the different dialects,
Yes.
it's really quite beautiful, and also people who had never even imagined talking about, or even coming into the museum. So there was
What year was that you did that video?
I did that in 2018. It opened in 2018. We started in 2017, so we had about 150 people all in all, and it was a kind of performative thing. I'd bring them into the museum and walk through in a certain kind of pattern and record their responses to the questions. And often they took on the voice of the object, as you can see here, and sometimes they spoke about the object. And it's a kind of touching record because what happened afterwards and with the explosion in Lebanon, there's something about this moment that right, also given what the revolutionary aspects that happened after. So yeah, I feel like talking about my work in general, I really am trying to in some way hold these moments that we experience together, and hold them without making them grander than they are, but just to kind of catch a fleeting aspect of our present.
Yeah, and that's what we've been doing, catching a fleeting aspect of your overall work that's so much wider and would, deserve much more than an hour. But unfortunately, we've run out of time.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Annabel, and of course also Kathryn. And I'd also like to thank Barbara Oberkötter and Mara Kessler, who have been supporting us. Kathryn and I will be in conversation with Sam al-Shaibi, Iraqi Palestinian photographer, in November. This event today will be made available. We'll have a recording, so we'll encourage you, we'll distribute it, circulate it, and you can share it with your friends and colleagues. Thank you so much, Annabel.
Thank you so much. Really nice to spend this hour with you.
Thank you so much, Annabel, and thank you, Nadje.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.